Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Edward, King and Martyr on this wonderful occasion of the 500th anniversary of celebrating Robert Barnes' sermon preached here on 500 years ago, 1525, his midnight mass that is said to have sparked the English Reformation, or at least given a little bit of kindle to these reformers' ideas. You are in a greatly historical, wonderful church. I've been the privilege of being the vicar chaplain over the last 10 years, or almost coming on to 10 years. And if you know the history, you'll know that back in 1446, King Henry VI decided that he wanted to build his King's College Chapel across the way and had to tear down a little church called St. John Zachary. That church was the parish church for Clare and for Trinity Hall. So in exchange for the land and the church, he said, right, you may have St. Edward's as your church. And thus was the beginning of a long relationship between St. Edward's and Trinity Hall, a very unique relationship among Cambridge colleges, because this served as the chapel for many years for the college. And actually, in fact, yesterday we heard from Professor Richard Rex, who was speaking on about the relationship, and there was one Trinity Hall master around the time of Barnes, who was John Puregold, who said in his will that he wanted to be buried here on the grounds beneath the church of St. Edward, King and Martyr. So we have a long-standing connection with Trinity Hall, and that connection still remains today. It is going to be a wonderful evening. Everything is in your program. I invite you to look on and see as we go along. Delightful music. We're incredibly grateful that Professor Alec Ryrie is joining us and is going to fill us more in on this incredible life of this chap called Robert Barnes, who boldly proclaimed from this very pulpit some of the early Reformation ideas. So let me turn it over to Stephen Plant, who is going to share with us some of Barnes's readings.
I'm going to read for you this evening 3 of the 25 paragraphs of Robert Barnes's recollection of what he had written. The sermon doesn't survive, but in 1531, Barnes wrote a memory, or wrote his recollection of what had been said. These ordinary bishops and prelates do follow that false prophet Balaam, for they would curse the people, but by the provision of God they are compelled to bless them. That is to say, to teach them to live well, though they themselves live most mischievously. And so the asses which they ride upon, that is, the common people, have their lives in abomination. They set up an idol to dissuade the people with all which is called Baal Peor, or Baal Thegor, which is interpreted gasping. That is, their laws and constitutions yet gasp and gape to maintain their worldly honor. They cause us to sacrifice by fair whim, that is, by their carnal affections and sweet words, that God of Israel is forgotten. And so by their sweet words and benediction, they dissuade simple people. They be the false masters that St. Peter speaketh of. These be fountains without water, for they give no good doctrine to the people. Now, they sell us. They sell the people. They sell holy orders. They sell church hallowing. There is no better merchandise in Cheapside. Wilt thou know what is the price of a church hallowing? No less than 40 shillings. They sell pardons and remissions of sins as openly as a cow and an ox is sold, for they never grant them without money. The suffragan of Ely did ask of Master Johann Purgold 40 shillings and the offering for hallowing of St. Edward's in Cambridge. Yea, and he would not do it so good cheap, but because he had a goddaughter buried in ye churchyard. But this may be proved by examples enough for bringing ye forth one church in all England that you have hallowed without money or without hope of money, and I will grant my conclusion false. And as for your pardons, all the world knoweth, your handling, I dare say, is yet the best merchandise in the world, as yon handle it still.
Thank you very much to Andrew and the Trinity Hall Choir. So, as Mark said, Trinity Hall's connection to St Edward's goes back to the mid-15th century, and we're very, very pleased to be marking this long relationship, this long connection today. The music, the Thomas Tallis, and the Dean Stephen's wonderful reading of the forthright language of Robert Barnes have helped, though, take us back to 1525. You can imagine the church then. We now have the privilege of hearing from Professor Alec Ryrie, Professor of the History of Christianity at Durham University and himself an alumnus of Trinity Hall, who is going to talk to us more about the sermon, the history and the legacy. After his lecture, there'll be time for some question and answer, but for now, please welcome Alec to the famous pulpit.
It was quite a sermon. They were more used to robust rhetoric in those days than we are. But when Robert Barnes ascended almost certainly this pulpit, certainly in this church, almost exactly 500 years ago, he was not messing around. And nor was this an affair that he blundered into by accident. The passages that Stephen read for us a moment ago were, as he says, only the beginning. We don't have the full text of the sermon, but the short excerpts that we do have, around 1,500 words worth of material, were those that were gathered to be the basis of a heresy charge against him. And we have those articles because Barnes himself included them in his published defense of himself 6 years later. So instead of an entire flow of the argument, we have these 24 snippets taken out of context, which were chosen because they were the most memorably and eye-poppingly offensive parts of what he said. But even with that caution in mind, it's clear enough that this was not an ordinary sermon. There is no doubt that Dr. Barnes was trying to start something, although I also think there's no doubt that he started more than he intended. At that point, Dr. Barnes was 30 years old, a Norfolk lad who'd come to Cambridge at the age of 10 to be educated by the Augustinian friars, the order which he joined. The Augustinians, one of the more earnest, intellectual, assertively pious of the religious orders of the day, men who were stereotypically not afraid to speak truth to power, a tendency which was seen in the most famous Augustinian friar of the 16th century, a German brother by the name of Martin Luther. Young Robert Barnes prospered as a scholar. Sometime in the mid-1510s, he was sent for further study at his order's house in Leuven, in what's now Belgium. The religious orders were formidably international in their networks. He stayed in Leuven until around 1522 and returned to Cambridge full of exciting new continental ideas. In 1523, he was made a doctor of theology, which is worth underlining. Nowadays, of course, a doctorate is the entry ticket to an academic career, but in this era, it was closer to being appointed to a named chair or elected to a learned society. This was a noteworthy accolade, which many excellent scholars never attained to. But this church is not where you would have expected to find him preaching on Sunday, the 24th of December, 1525, because Dr. Barnes was an Augustinian friar. The natural place would have been him to preach in the friary church. The scheduled preacher here was to have been one Hugh Latimer, very much a kindred spirit of Barnes's, himself maybe the finest English preacher of his generation. But on Christmas Eve, 1525, the two men swapped pulpits, and we don't know exactly why. Barnes claimed that he simply came here at the request of the parish. We do, though, know who arranged this swap. A mutual friend of the two men, a man named Thomas Bilney, who, unlike either Barnes or Latimer, was a Trinity Hall man. Bilney had apparently been urging Barnes to make a public declaration of some kind. Robert Barnes, Thomas Bilney, Hugh Latimer. Already we have three names to conjure with, who are going to become three giants of the English Reformation, and all of whom would in due course die the same death. Still, however it happened, on Christmas Eve, Robert Barnes stood up to preach, and he did so, as you have already heard, with one clear target in mind. He was launching a broadside attack on the bishops of the English Church, as a group, but above all, on one bishop, Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop of York, Prince Bishop of Durham, Cardinal, Papal Legate, the man who almost embodied the English Church in his ample person. When Barnes said in his sermon, "I will never believe, nor can I never believe, that one man may by the law of God be a bishop of 2 or 3 cities, yea, of an whole country," everyone knew who he was talking about. When a few weeks later Barnes found himself being interrogated by Wolsey himself, the cardinal read through all the articles and stopped at that one and said it touched him personally, although Wolsey, who was not given to ranting and raving, seems to have taken it rather mildly. Wolsey's also clearly in view in some of Barnes's other points, such as when he lambasts the bishops for exercising religious and secular jurisdiction at the same time, which could have been said of several bishops, but Wolsey is the Lord Chancellor of England, amongst his other offices. But for Barnes, Wolsey is only one representative of an entirely corrupt episcopal class. It cannot be proved by Scripture, he said, that a man of the church should have so great temporal possessions. But they will say that if they hadn't so great possessions, they couldn't keep so many servants, so many dogs, so many horses as 40 or 50, and maintain so great pomp and pride, and live so deliciously. I suspect, in fact, that is not quite how the bishops would have defended their incomes. But it's plain this wasn't just an attack on one corrupt bishop, but an entire class of men. They say, Barnes said, that they be successors of Christ and of his apostles, but I can see them follow none but Judas, for they bear the purse. And if they'd not so great possessions, I'm sure 100 would speak against them, where now dare not one for loss of their promotion. The whole English church was paralyzed, he says, by fear and greed, so much so that it dare not speak the obvious truth. The whole church, that is, apart from Robert Barnes, playing the part of the boy in the crowd who dares to shout out what everyone can see, that this particular emperor's clothes were crassly, were offensively sumptuous, mitres with glistering precious stones, wearing gloves in case they catch cold in the midst of their ceremonies, rings on their fingers, cloth of gold on their backs, not the rough plain weave once worn by Christ and his apostles. Every common Christian can see it, he said. The bishops know it themselves. There's not the greatest Pharisee in this church, but I am sure I prick him with these words, and he knoweth that these things be true, though he say the contrary, and that do I know well. But, he said, although they know their sin, they don't repent. Instead, they exploit their position for cash. This is what Stephen was reading to us. They trick the poor into trading their scarce pennies for empty rights. They claim to be able to spare souls from heaven to offer plenary absolutions, which Barnes insists is just a theological mistake, but one that no one can be permitted to challenge because no one is ever permitted to question their powers. And at the sermon's end, he cycled back to his visceral revulsion at the lordliness, the grandeur of these supposed shepherds of Christ's flock. Mitres, he asked, of the distinctive split cap worn by bishops. Where do they come from? Maybe, he wondered maliciously, maybe they're Jewish, by which he meant they represent a corrupt, carnal religion of empty, blood-stained ritual. It was, of course, completely normal to use Judaism as a symbol of error in this way in a country where the practice of Judaism had been illegal for over 200 years. Not that that justifies it. Or perhaps, he wondered, the two horns of the mitre, as he called them, are simply the horns of the false prophet foretold in the Old Testament. And there is more, but you get the idea. One of the differences between Barnes's congregation and our gathering here this evening is that none of the bishops whom he was berating were actually present. Whereas tonight we do actually have two bishops with us, so my apologies. He later said this was one of the complaints made against him. How dare he lambast the bishops behind their backs? To which his answer was, well, they never come to church. They would never stay to hear such a reproach. Now, there's no doubt that Barnes knew he was stirring up trouble. You can see it if you read the articles in order. In the first few, he's clearly trying to nerve himself to work out quite how far he was actually willing to go that Christmas Eve. The very first article is the only one with any sort of seasonal reference. He says, if thou believe that thou art more bound to serve God tomorrow, which is Christmas Day, or Easter Day, or Whitsunday, for any holiness that is in that one day more than in another, then thou art no faithful Christian man, but superstitious. Instead, unto a faithful Christian man, every day ought to be Christmas Day, Easter Day, and Whitsunday. But, he then added, the church fathers had instituted those feasts because they saw that if particular days weren't set apart for devotion, true piety would simply wither away. Which is provocative, but it's not heretical. And from there we find him saying, nowadays dare no man preach the true and the very gospel of God, a state of affairs he prays may soon be remedied. This is what I mean when I say he's trying to nerve himself, because he plainly thinks, and it turns out he thought with good reason, that there were malicious listeners out there in his audience listening eagerly for any words he uttered that they could twist against him. I hope also a difference between that evening and this one. He compares those listeners to dogs who, if they so much as hear the voice of someone who doesn't belong to their household, will set about barking furiously. In this case, he says, when those dogs hear a true preacher's voice, they bark, and heretic, ad ignem, to the fire, to the fire. And he went on in what becomes maybe the most famous line of his sermon. We make nowadays many martyrs. I trust we shall have many more shortly. For the verity could never be preached plainly, but persecution did follow. And it did, but almost certainly harder and stronger than he expected. The sermon absolutely caused a stir. We're told it provokes a flurry of further preaching across the university and the city, some preachers echoing Barnes, some opposing him. I don't think Barnes can have been surprised when very soon after his sermon he received an order from the then Vice-Chancellor of the university prohibiting him from preaching again at St. Edward's the following week, as he'd been due to, nor when he eventually receives a summons from the Vice-Chancellor for his words and was interrogated by the VC and half a dozen senior clergymen. The interview does not go well. It begins with Barnes denying that the words that were reported about him were quite correct, but it very quickly escalates into him comparing himself to Christ being condemned by false witnesses. Again, that sense that he's steeling himself for a dose of persecution. But then they actually present the articles against him that some of the witnesses had gathered. And he is told that some of them are contentious, some of them are seditious, some of them are slanderous, and some were heretical. And the way Barnes tells the story, it sounds as if that last word hung ominously in the air, as well it might. In what way heretical, he asked. This seems to have been the point when he realized that this wasn't just going to be a matter of university discipline. And it's what sets him on the road to being, a month later, interviewed personally by the cardinal, against whom he had been railing. His dismay at being accused of heresy is understandable, I mean, not just emotionally, but I think also intellectually. A good case could be made that while Barnes's remarks are certainly contentious, slanderous, maybe even seditious, that they don't rise to the level of heresy. As Barnes said when he defended his remarks, criticizing the wealth, the hypocrisy, the corruption of senior clergymen, this has been a mainstay of Christian preaching for centuries. He doesn't expect them to like it, but it's not heresy. When he writes his full-scale defense of the articles alleged against him years later, this is his principal theme. And in lawyers' terms, he's right. But if I can say such a thing in the presence of so many Trinity Hall dignitaries, sometimes the lawyer's answer is not enough. That's partly because of one other element of the story, of the sermon, which is worth noticing. This is the part that Barnes is at particular pains to try to explain away. The story that he told was this. During December 1525, Barnes found himself called on to intervene in a dispute over a modest bequest which had been left to this very church, and which the executor of the will had failed to deliver. And the church warden then pursued the executor at law and had him thrown into debtor's prison. Barnes tries, and apparently this happened the day before the sermon, Saturday the 23rd, tried to persuade the church warden to let the man go and forget the bequest, but to no avail. And he then stood up to preach this sermon and saw the same church warden standing there, and by his account decided there and then, without premeditation, to tackle the matter. As he put it, I recited the case in a parable, so that no man knew what I meant, but he and I. So, this is what he actually said, or at least these are the words that caused the trouble. These laws, these lawyers, these justiciaries that say that a man may lawfully ask his own good afore a judge and contend in judgment, they have destroyed all patience, devotion, and faith in Christian people. This pleading in judgment is manifestly against the gospel. A Christian man may not contend in judgment with his brother for his private wealth. Now, his claim that that was a coded reprimand to one man feels a bit dicey to me. The words don't really seem to fit it. And there is a further problem with that story, which the Protestant historian John Fox revealed in his account of this incident written in the 1560s. Fox tells us that Barnes's sermon was based on, well, for now let's just say on a model published in Germany 4 years earlier in 1521. We don't really know how true that was because, of course, we don't have the full text of the sermon. But the analysis done by Professor Rex of Queen's College has pinned this matter down. Obviously, the German model sermon, which we do have, didn't include a lot of railing against English bishops. But there are some points of similarity. In particular, that model has a substantial digression in it about the evils of litigiousness, which, as Rex points out, was not at all an obvious thing to do with the text on which the sermon was based. In other words, it looks very much as if those excoriating comments on the law and lawyers were not, in fact, an off-the-cuff sideswipe at one person in the congregation, as Barnes later claimed, but a planned part of the sermon. And the point matters because this is one of the most potentially explosive things he says, which is why he makes such a tortuous effort to explain it away. Explosive not just because standing up in a Trinity Hall church and unleashing a broadside against lawyers has never been a good way to make friends. It is not, Barnes later wrote, trying to dig himself out of this hole, it is not mine intent to forbid suing at the law, for I know very well that the magistrate is of God, that good laws be God's gifts, wherefore it must needs follow that we may lawfully use them. But the excerpt that was condemned does make it sound very much as if that was exactly what he was saying. Remember, he says, pleading in judgment is manifestly against the gospel. A Christian man may not contend with his brother for his private wealth. Even those of you who aren't lawyers might feel the frisson of radicalism about that claim. It sounds positively sectarian, as if he's calling for a pious subset of the English, those who regard themselves as true Christians, to withdraw from the king's courts, to arbitrate their own affairs amongst themselves. And it unmistakably sounds as if he's setting up his vision of the church against these laws, these lawyers, the king's laws, the very sinews of an ordered Christian society. You can catch just a whiff of fanaticism. Still, you've all gathered here tonight because you were promised a sermon that lit the fuse of the English Reformation, and so far you might legitimately be feeling a little shortchanged. This isn't really heresy. It's certainly not the variant of heresy that would later be called Protestantism. There's nothing in any of this of the major theological themes that Martin Luther and his allies and his fellow travelers were already by this point articulating forcefully in Germany. There's no hint of the doctrine of justification by faith or alone. There's no hint of the doctrine of sola scriptura. There's no attack on the doctrine of the sacraments, nothing about images or saints. The barest concern about indulgences, which focuses wholly on financial corruption. There's nothing about clerical marriage or monasticism or the priesthood of all believers. The fact that you disapprove of Cardinal Wolsey doesn't make you a Lutheran. So, why all the fuss? Well, for two reasons. One is that if we widen the lens, we can see why this sermon in this place at this moment meant more than just its already inflammatory contents. And the second is that this sermon in this place and at that moment set off a chain of events which none of the participants could have foreseen. In retrospect, some of what followed seems inevitable, some very definitely doesn't. And so for the remainder of my time this evening, I want to follow those two tracks. First of all, what this sermon meant in its wider context, and secondly, where it led. Now, by wider context, I mean most obviously certain events that had been unfolding in Germany for the previous 8 years, ever since that other combative Augustinian friar and doctor of theology, Martin Luther, had used his university platform to issue an unguarded denunciation of church corruption. And that one had provoked an escalating series of confrontations, which led not only to Luther's excommunication and his condemnation as a heretic, but also to him developing and articulating a really thoroughgoing, radical theological critique of some fundamental features of Western Christianity. It led to him building mass support for that critique and various allied positions through a print and preaching campaign with a breadth that had no real precedent in human history up to that point. And ultimately, it led in 1524 to 5, only months before Barnes stood up to speak, to the event we call the German Peasants' War, the largest mass popular rebellion in the whole of European history before the French Revolution. An event which was shot through with religious radicalism and which ended with a death toll which is unknowable but may well be in the order of 100,000 people. England, a country that was no stranger to civil wars and mass rebellions, wasn't directly affected, but that kind of thing doesn't go unnoticed. England's king, Henry VIII, early on in the Luther affair, makes a tactical decision to take a very public stance against the rogue German and his ideas. The king even ghostwrites a book against Luther in a successful attempt to persuade the Pope to grant him the honorific title he'd been badgering the Pope for years. Very much suits Henry, for him and his country, to strike the pose of stout defenders of orthodoxy, unlike the chaotic Germans or the devious French or the too subtle by half Italians. And so the solemn book burning in London in 1521, when a series of Lutheran books are consigned to the flames by Cardinal Wolsey, this is an entirely staged event. Its main audience are the foreign ambassadors who are invited to witness it. There are no actual Lutherans in England by this point. The books had had to be imported specially in order to be burned. But by 1525, when heresy appeared to have set the whole of Germany on fire, there were signs that the flames were starting to lick at England's eastern edge too. The link, the first real personal connection between England and Germany's heresies, was a Gloucestershire and Oxford man named William Tyndale, who had decided to undertake a translation of the New Testament direct from Greek into English, and by 1525 was in Cologne trying to get it printed so that it could be shipped, illegally of course, back into England. And this was plainly intended not, as he may have thought at first, as an innocent project in biblical popularization, but as a vector for Luther's ideas and associated. England's church begins at this point to get itself ready for some real trouble. And it's worth pointing out that England's church is in a pretty good position to do so, because for all of Barnes's criticism of the bishops for their self-serving corruption, this is a bit overdone. By European standards, England's bishops at the times are a remarkably impressive group of men, scholars, theologians, skilled administrators, most of them men of relatively humble birth, who had risen through the ranks on talent. None of them the obviously debauched, corrupt aristocrats and simoniacs who all too obviously filled the episcopate in France, in Scotland, in much of Germany, not least in Italy. Cardinal Wolsey, he may not have been a saint, but he was a very serious churchman, and as a political administrator, he was a generational talent. People who had their ears to the ground in Cambridge in 1525 will have begun to get the sense that things were starting, as they say nowadays, to get real. Maybe this is why Barnes and his friends staged their intervention when they did. Or maybe it's a coincidence, we don't really know. But from the perspective of the bishops whom Barnes was lambasting, this sermon wasn't an isolated incident that they could afford to shrug off. It's part of a wider pattern. I mentioned that Barnes's sermon was based in part on a German model published in 1521. That German original was, of course, by Martin Luther himself. That particular sermon of Luther's didn't actually teach any of his set-piece heresies, but using even an orthodox text written by an arch-heretic doesn't smell good. Worse than that, in fact, owning and reading Luther's books was already specifically banned in England, regardless of their contents. In a moment when the threat of Lutheran books was turning from a theoretical possibility into an all-too-present reality, preaching this sermon may have been more provocative than Barnes intended. He wasn't to know that only a month after the sermon, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Sir Thomas More, would, acting on intelligence, lead a raid into the German merchant settlement in London and uncover a stash of Lutheran books there. It's in the wake of that raid, at the beginning of February 1526, that Barnes is actually arrested and brought up to London for interrogation. And the two cases, Barnes and the German merchants, very much handled in parallel. In the end, he is brought with 5 of them to St. Paul's Cathedral to make their formal penance together on the 11th of February 1526. So that's one context. But there's an immediate context in Cambridge that matters too. Remember that huddle between Barnes and his friends, Thomas Bilney, Hugh Latimer, by which they get him into this pulpit that day? Barnes was not speaking just for himself. He's a sort of spokesperson for a restless, reformist mood that was abroad amongst a group of young scholars in mid-1520s Cambridge. Now, this is very well known to scholars of the field. It is a subject thick with myth-making. The hoariest of these myths is that groups of these scholars used to gather at the White Horse Inn on Trumpington Street to debate the new ideas, so much so that the White Horse became derisively known in Cambridge as Little Germany, a sort of Cambridge equivalent of Lewis and Tolkien's Inklings gathering in the Eagle and Child in Oxford 400 years later. But how truly German, how Lutheran was any of this? The beautifully precise and subtle work on the nascent evangelical movement in 1520s Cambridge that was done by my former doctoral student Colin Donnelly a few years ago shows that while later Protestant generations naturally wanted to claim these early English reformers for their own cause, that's not quite how it looked at the time. There's undoubtedly a restless, provocative reforming zeal abroad in Cambridge. Barnes, along with Latimer, along with Bilney, these are some of its leading lights. It seems pretty clear that Barnes brings at least part of this mood back with him from his years in Leuven. The fact that Barnes is an Augustinian friar, part of Luther's order, that he's spent so many years in Leuven, where he has almost a ringside seat for the unfolding dramas in Germany, might make you think that the mood he's brought back with him is Lutheran. That doesn't seem to have been the case. The great scholar at whose feet Leuven sat, as indeed did Cambridge, was not Luther. It was Erasmus of Rotterdam, the supreme intellectual celebrity of the age, the 16th century's Einstein or Dickens or Voltaire, a man who mixed brilliant scholarship with shameless self-promotion, profound piety, acidic sarcasm, and a very finely judged sense of just how far he could push his luck. How far Erasmus's scholarship was connected to Luther's Reformation, this is not a question to start opening up late on a Saturday night. So I will skate over this. The famous quip which Erasmus himself reported in order to reject was that Erasmus laid the egg and Luther hatched it. That Erasmus sent dangerous ideas out into the world half-developed and then walked away from them, taking no responsibility for what he'd done, which may have been truer than he wanted to admit. There is no doubting that when the time for making sharp choices came, Erasmus's own loyalties were with Rome, with the universal church, and also that Erasmus loathed many of Luther's actual theological ideas. But when I say, and as Dr. Donnelly has argued persuasively, that the evangelical mood abroad in Cambridge in the 1520s wasn't so much Lutheran as a kind of hyper-Erasmianism. Erasmus's ideas with the guardrails removed, more Erasmian than Erasmus. That's not to say that any of it was orthodox. Maybe, as we've seen in Barnes's sermon, it manages not quite to plant a foot on the other side of the chasm, but it has stretched far enough out across what is supposed to be a void that only one jump is necessary. Never mind the specific doctrines. Look at the mood. Restless, hypercritical, ready to tear down or eat away at existing structures and institutions in the pursuit of Christian truth, quick to wield scorn against anything that could be called superstition, to mock the hierarchy's pretensions to moral authority. It's not Lutheran heresy, but it's land that's been cleared and ploughed. It will only take a few heretical seeds to land in it, for them to be able to take root and discover that the climate suits them perfectly. The Orthodox churchmen in Cambridge's orbit are well aware of this mood and what's taking root amongst some bright young sparks in the university, even if they couldn't quite pin it down. I think this is how we make sense of that line from Barnes's sermon about people crying, "To the fire!" and his warning that we nowadays make many martyrs. What martyrs might he mean? Does he mean the thousands of rebels left for the dead on the battlefields of Germany? Or, dangerous thought, perhaps he meant Jan van Essen and Hendrik Vos, two friars from Barnes's own Augustinian order, who a little over a year before had been burned for Lutheran heresies in Brussels, less than a day's journey from Barnes's old home base in Leuven. That's what one of the bishops who interrogated Barnes suspected that he meant. He specifically asked Barnes if he was referring to them. And Barnes replied, "I knew not their cause wherefore they died, but I reckoned as many men to be martyrs as were persecuted and died for the word of God." And the bishop, Barnes reported, said he would make me fry for this. Perhaps that's not quite what he said. But that sense of impatience is authentic. That these scholars are playing with words and dancing in and out of responsibility with these teasing provocations. So you might not be able to prove in lawyers' terms that Barnes is a heretic, but it's as plain as the nose on your face. A couple of years later, Bishop Nick of Norwich notoriously said about graduates of Gonville Hall, Trinity Hall's neighbour, of course, in its pre-John Keys days, said of the graduates of Gonville Hall that it didn't matter how holy they seemed, they still savoured of the frying pan. A smell of heresy hung around them, a presentiment of the ways their stories would end. And it was Bishop Nick who oversaw the trial of the first of those young Cambridge hyper-Erasmians whose time ran out. Not, as it happened, a Gonville man, but our friend from Trinity Hall, Thomas Bilney, who was burned as a heretic in Norwich in 1531. So I hope those contexts help to explain why Barnes's sermon landed as more than just a routine broadside against bad bishops. When he said that that was what all that he was doing, he's making a fair case. Perhaps he even believed it himself. But, as they used to say, you may not be able to prove he's a heretic, but the dogs in the street know it. Hence the barking, and heretic, ad ignem, ad ignem. And events would prove them right. Because the real significance of this sermon, the reason we remember it, is not so much what it reveals about that one febrile moment, but what it set in motion. It sparked immediate controversy, as it was meant to. If the stubborn legend of those debates at the White Horse Inn has any basis in fact, the one source that describes it is quite specific about how it happened, that it was immediately after Barnes's sermon that the people whom our witness calls the secret learned of the university were emboldened to come out into the open and to begin to explore these dangerous ideas more publicly. The network of Cambridge evangelicals, which Dr. Donnelly has reconstructed so successfully, was apparently spurred forward by this moment, or at least they make it into their foundation myth, and they make Barnes into their lost leader. As so often with limited and sporadic persecution, Barnes's arrest and discipline doesn't serve as a deterrent. It serves as an encouragement. It would be a while yet before the Cambridge hyper-Erasmians, men like Latimer and indeed Bilney, would unmistakably embrace Martin Luther's ideas. But many of them would remember Barnes's sermon as the starting whistle for that long journey. And yet the more significant story is what happens to Barnes himself. So he's brought to London, he's interrogated by this formidable roster of dignitaries and bishops, 6 days later, he's brought to St. Paul's, along with 5 of the German merchants, and made formally to recant. And in a less fraught atmosphere, that might have been it. But not in early 1526. He's sent to the Fleet prison in London and remains there for 6 months. Then he's transferred to the London house of his own Augustinian order, but still as a prisoner of sorts, not an ordinary friar. But he could at least receive visitors, and he was apparently able to buy and to keep books. We know this because by now copies of William Tyndale's English New Testament were being smuggled illegally into England, and Barnes had got hold of some. In the autumn of 1526, not long after he's moved to the Augustinian house, he had a pair of visitors there who had come all the way from the village of Steeple Bumpstead in Essex. These men were Lollards, members of the old, marginalised, underground English heretical movement that had been hanging on in rural cracks and crevices for a century or more. The fact that they'd heard of Barnes, that they sought him out, that tells its own story. Anyway, they proudly showed him their treasures, English biblical translations, handwritten texts of the Lollard translation dating back to the 14th century. Barnes, our witness tells us, was rather rude about them. A point of them, for them, he said dismissively, they are not to be regarded next to the new printed testament, which is of cleaner English. And instead of taking the hump, they gratefully bought a pair of Tyndale testaments from him. It's presumably this sort of behaviour which prompted the next move, apparently during the winter of 1526-7, when Barnes was shifted to the Augustinian house at Northampton, which he apparently regarded as exile to the ends of the earth, and where he spent nearly 2 miserable years, and this time rather more plainly a prisoner than he had been before. The story of how this imprisonment came to an end, well, the story we have is the story we have. There's no corroboration, there's no alternative, so here it is, see what you make of it. Word apparently reached Barnes that after all this time he is actually going to be put on trial for heresy and is at risk of death by burning. But the messenger who brings him this unwelcome news also has a plan. His advice was to feign himself to be desperate, to pretend to be overcome by despair, that he should write a letter to the cardinal and leave it on his table, to declare he was gone to drown himself, to leave his clothes there in the same place, and another letter to be left to the mayor of the town, to the mayor of Northampton, to search for him in the water because he had a letter written in parchment about his neck, closed in wax, for the cardinal, which would teach all men to beware by his example. And we're told that Barnes did exactly this. He left these suicide notes, he left his friar's habit, and apparently they spent a week dragging the river searching for his body. Meanwhile, he was conveyed to London in a poor man's apparel, and so tarried not there, but took shipping, and went by the long seas to Antwerp, and so to Luther. How much of this has gained in the telling, we will never know. But this much is true. By 1529, we know he's in the northern German city of Lübeck. By 1530, he is in Luther's home city of Wittenberg, living under the pseudonym Antonius Anglus. He met Luther, and they seem to have become genuinely close. Luther often spoke of him with real affection. And it's from this point on that Barnes's religious identity becomes a simpler matter. We don't have to wonder if he was an evangelical or a hyper-Erasmian or a proto-Protestant or a Lollard fellow traveller. He was a Lutheran, almost straightforwardly so. In other words, he had finally become exactly what his persecutors feared that he might be. Is that because on that Christmas Eve in 1525 he was already a Lutheran at heart? Or because he wasn't yet a Lutheran but already set on a path that was inevitably going to take him to that point? Or was there a wider range of reformist possibilities still open to him in 1525? And that it was only the process of being treated as a Lutheran, interrogated and condemned with Lutherans, imprisoned as a Lutheran, which finally led him to flee and find refuge and a new spiritual home with actual Lutherans, that in the end his persecutors helped to conjure the spectre of which they were so afraid. Either way, Barnes can stand as the leader and the emblem of how English evangelicalism transitioned from a nascent, nebulous mood of reformist idealism into a serious life-on-the-line commitment to what was going to become Protestantism, and how this happened during the late 1520s, paralleling the journey that led his friend Thomas Bilney to the stake and William Tyndale into exile. Barnes and Tyndale meet in Wittenberg. They became not exactly the closest of friends, but at least colleagues and collaborators, and the two most prominent figures in what became a small but pretty high-powered community of English evangelical exiles. That could easily, maybe should have been, the story of the English Reformation. These few heroic purists and idealists, driven into exile by their performatively orthodox king, free to nurture impossible ideals, such as the idea that no one should ever take anyone else to court, free to rail satisfyingly and impotently against the wealth and the corruption of the bishops. It was a calling to that kind of impotent purity that leads Barnes to publish in 1531 a book which told his side of the story, and which, despite its title, it was called A Supplication unto the Most Excellent and Redoubted Prince King Henry VIII. It's not really an appeal that expects an answer. It's a lonely self-vindication from an exile who has little hope of actually returning, except in secret. It's the same instinct which leads Tyndale ferociously to denounce Henry VIII's monstrous plan to throw over his faithful and blameless wife, Catherine of Aragon, in pursuit of an illegal second marriage. No good Christian, let alone these heroic evangelicals, could tolerate such blameless, such blatant and shameless adultery, you would think. But of course, as Henry VIII's marriage problems ballooned into what was going to become the era's defining diplomatic and religious crisis, most English evangelicals discovered that there was, in fact, an alternative. It did mean that they had to square their consciences with the king's dubious marital ambitions. But if they could find a way of doing that, then they could make an alliance with the king against the Pope. And that meant, not least because they would have the help of the king's new wife, that they could leverage that alliance to start reforming the English church along the lines they hoped for. Those Cambridge evangelicals, the ones who hadn't yet been burned, started to find that they had friends in high places. Hugh Latimer, Barnes's friend, was made a royal chaplain. And then, in 1535, irony of ironies, he's made a bishop. I think, rather to his credit, he hated being a bishop and he was terrible at it. And Barnes, well, in 1534, Barnes published a revised version of his supplication to the king. And it's almost a different book. If the first one is a vindication and a denunciation, this one is more of a job application. Because he now genuinely believes, and believes with some reason, that there might be a deal to be struck with the King of England, by which the gospel that Barnes had first tried openly to preach in this church 8 long years previously might become the Church of England's new orthodoxy. This is another way that Barnes is an emblem of the English Reformation, that he, unlike Tyndale, made that pragmatic decision to make a deal, to sell his soul to the king as long as the price was right. And since in another 30 years Barnes's religious allies had finally and decisively won, The Church of England had embraced a Protestant prayer book and confession of faith, and Barnes himself was being celebrated as one of its heroes. Well, you might say he made the right call, even if the version of evangelicalism that England embraced was a little tame, didn't have the wild purity, the naive clarity that Barnes had preached here once upon a time in his days of innocence. But there was, of course, a sharper price to be paid. Barnes himself returned to England in 1534 as part of an embassy from the Lutheran princes of Germany, and several times over the following years would serve as a go-between for England and the German princes. But plenty of people in England still remembered him as a heretic. Henry VIII's court was a shifting minefield, and Robert Barnes still savoured of the frying pan. And he also hadn't lost his knack for provocative preaching. It's in March 1540 that finally catches up with him. In April of that year, after a ferocious sermon, he's imprisoned in the Tower of London. And on the 30th of July 1540, almost as an accidental side casualty of that summer's murderous religious politics, Barnes and two of his associates are burned alive at Smithfield in London. He'd predicted it 15 years earlier. We make nowadays many martyrs. I trust we shall have many more shortly, for the verity could never be preached plainly, but persecution did follow. But then since that entire generation of Cambridge's and of England's evangelical leaders, Thomas Bilney, Hugh Latimer, William Tyndale, Thomas Cranmer, John Frith, many, many more would sooner or later join Barnes in the fires. It is, I think, in his death, as well as in his life, that he can serve as an emblem of the English Reformation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Alec. I think you really vividly brought to life both what it must have been like to be in this church when that sermon was given, but also really fascinating to hear what followed and the legacy. Questions? Questions? Any questions? Yes, please, at the back. Could you stand up and we'll have to project.
That's a really good question. How does it spread out from here? Quite slowly is the answer. There's a reason why Cambridge retains a particular reputation as a centre for this kind of Christianity, let's say, for the rest of that decade and indeed beyond. But it does spread, and there are two particular moments which lead to that in the late 20s. One is Cardinal Wolsey's pet project to found a new college in Oxford, Cardinal College, based on the old Priory of St. Friedeswides, the college which by a roundabout route becomes the ancestor of what's now Christchurch. And this is, it's a new foundation, and Wolsey decides to staff it by bringing over a group of men from Cambridge. And that seems to have been the first significant insertion of this kind of religion into an Oxford context. Bilney is often spoken of as the first martyr of the English Reformation, which, even if you're talking about burnings, isn't strictly true. There was a fellow called Thomas Hitton who was burned in Kent some months earlier, although we know almost nothing about him. But I think, strictly speaking, the first martyrs of the English Reformation are some of those evangelicals brought over to Cardinal College in 1528. because when what's going on amongst them is discovered, they end up being imprisoned in the college's salt fish cellar, and some of them end up dying in those less than salubrious conditions. I mean, is that, burned alive, dying in the salt fish cellar? Oxford, though, as a university, remains staunchly more conservative throughout really throughout the century. There's a point when Thomas Cranmer, as Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1540s, is trying to reform the setup of preachers in Canterbury Cathedral, where there are 6 licensed preachers attached to the cathedral. And there is talk that there should be an attempt to achieve partisan balance between them, that there should be 3 conservatives and 3 reformers, which is really interesting because it's one of the few times that people at the time have got to try to put labels on these parties that describe them. And the label they use is we should have 3 of Cambridge and 3 of Oxford. That's sort of an accepted shorthand for what the two universities stand for. But London is a different matter. And because, of course, the nature of a university is that students don't stay here forever as much as they might wish to. And the movement of clergy out from Cambridge, and many of them especially going to London, starts to seed networks there. And in particular, Simon Foreman, who's the former, is he the Provost of Queen's? A senior figure at Queen's, becomes the rector of a parish church in the City of London, and seems to have used this as the basis of an evangelical book distribution network, which is broken up with some difficulty by the Bishop of London's men in 1528-29. So you can see there that sort of incident is symbolic of how this kind of thing may be rooted much more firmly here than, really anywhere else in England. But it can't be confined to it.
Thank you. Gentleman here, yes? Oh, we've got a microphone. Brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is David. I've just asked Grok AI what Robert Barnes would preach if he was in your position today. What do you think he would preach if it was in the same spirit of a critique of clergy in the Church of England?
I'm trying not to catch the eye of the bishop sat down here. I'm very wary of that sort of question, not only because it's going to get me into trouble, but because the temptation is to start recruiting Barnes to my own prejudices. I think it's a temptation which any of us are subject to. You can see this in the way that exactly that question is being asked and being weaponized in the decades and centuries after the Reformation, where the battle to claim Thomas Cranmer, for example, for one side or the other. This is what he would have said in our day. He would have taken my side against my enemies. No, he would have taken my, and of course, when you tease back through the writings of somebody who's been long dead, speaking to a different context, to different preoccupations, if you're careful enough to sift them, you can find things that are going to suit your own preferences. That was an evasive answer. So let me add that I suspect his disdain for the process of pursuing one another at law, whether that be in the church or the wider world, is one that he might feel still had some purchase in our own time.
Did I see a hand? Yes, that's right, gentleman over here, sorry. The microphone, thank you.
May I ask, how does Thomas Cromwell fit into this story? I believe he may have been a supporter of Robert Barnes, and that after his fall, that made Robert Barnes's demise more likely. But why would Cromwell support him if he'd been so critical of Cardinal Wolsey?
That's a very good question. Yes, Cromwell is not somebody I mentioned today because the story is already complicated enough, but is certainly a part of this. They don't ever seem to have been particularly close, but they are politically aligned in various ways. So, I mean, there's two obvious points of connection. One is that I think it's clear, okay, 3 points of connection. One is it's clear as a matter of doctrine, of religious convictions, that they are at the very least fellow travelers, that they're sympathetic to each other, many of their ideas. So despite Cromwell's loyalty to his old, I mean, if Cromwell had taken against every evangelical who ever had something rude to say about Cardinal Wolsey, he would have found himself without very many friends. His affection for Wolsey was a little unusual if he knew it. That would not be a deal breaker for him, although it might have precluded a close friendship. So there's doctrinal alignment, and there's a diplomatic alignment too, and I think this is particularly important. That I mean, Barnes's diplomatic career during the period from 1534 to 40 is quite a strange one. He served as an ambassador for both sides, because he is one of the few people who really seems to have that capacity to have been trusted, at least to some extent, by both the Lutheran princes of Germany and by at least elements of the English establishment, and above all that means Cromwell. Trying to negotiate a serious military alliance between England and the Lutheran Schmalkaldic League in Germany is one of Cromwell's real priorities. It is arguably the pursuit more than any other that brings Cromwell down, because it's what leads him to negotiating what turns into the disaster of Henry VIII's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves. And of course, the other connection between them, as you're implying, is Barnes's death. He's burned on the 30th of June. That's 2 days after the execution of Thomas Cromwell. It's very clear that in the king's eyes, he is seen as not simply as one of Cromwell's protégés, but as a sign of what made Cromwell dangerous, of the lines that Cromwell had crossed. I mean, Cromwell's execution remains deeply mysterious, and in some ways, I think the attempt to explain why Henry VIII keeps suddenly and inexplicably murdering the people who are close to him and try to find rationales for it is to miss the point. This is what the man did. But the fact that when he does that, for one of the many times he does it in June of 1540, when Thomas Cromwell is his target, the fact that Barnes is one of really very few people, actually, who Cromwell drags down with him, who's caught up in that, tells its own story.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have one last question, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I think I'm right that the fact that this was a sort of living of Trinity Hall meant that it was exempt from the Bishop of Ely's sort of jurisdiction. I don't know if that's correct, but that people might have therefore come specifically to this church to hear things that they might not have been able to hear in other churches. And so given that Latimer was the alternative preacher and might have said something along similar lines, I wondered how many of the congregation might have expected to hear what they heard and might have even come specifically, looking out for something provocative.
Well, I'm in no position to speak about the the jurisdictional particularities of what happens here.
I think that is right. It's sat slightly apart, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the extent to which
Yeah.
that would be possible, quite what you can get away with.
Yeah.
A
You'll know
really
better than
interesting
me.
question. I'd love to hear from people who know the detail. Of course, the question of what people came expecting that Christmas Eve. As I say, clearly this was a planned event. It's premeditated to some extent. We know that there were the suspicious who came expecting trouble, ready to take notes, ready to stand as witnesses. It would only make sense, if you were Bilney or Latimer or indeed Barnes himself, if you've gone to a little bit of trouble to set up this event and you're aware that you're taking a little bit of a risk, then you wouldn't want it to simply be talking to kind of three sleeping parishioners and their dog at the back. So we have to assume that the fact it causes so much of a stir is not simply because of the malicious reports, but because a group of people have gathered here. It's a very tempting train of thought, and I'm very drawn to it, because it does come as part of that sense that the evangelical community in Cambridge are brethren of a sort. There's something of the secret society about them. Or secret society is overstating it. Something of the student clique. That these are young folks who have come to share a certain jargon, some vocabulary, some ideas, some common points of reference, shorthand which they can expect of one another, ways of communicating with a nod and a wink so that you know what they know what each other mean. There's something when you listen to those excerpts from Barnes's sermon that give you a sense of dropping in the middle of an ongoing conversation. So it absolutely, and in particular, that moment where he's saying we should refrain from engaging with the law with its sectarian tinge has something of the sense of a subculture to it. So I'm very tempted to believe that you're right, that there was a gathering of the brethren here. The trouble is, you pursue that line of thought and you begin to think there's already a fully formed sect taking shape here, and it is easy to conjure up great movements, all meeting for their formal lectures in the White Horse Inn, from nothing apart from supposition and imagination. So I want to believe that you're right, but much as I want to believe that this is the authentic pulpit in which Barnes preached his sermon, and it seems very likely, but...
That's a wonderful place to close, Eric. Thank you very much. And then we're going to hear a final piece of music from the choir, the Coventry Carol, again, very fitting for this time of year. But Alec, thank you very much indeed.
Little tiny
Sadly, we've come almost to the end of our evening, and it's appropriate to say a wonderful round of thanks to Mary Hockaday for Trinity Hall for bringing this event together, and all the people who worked behind the scenes to bring this together. Thank you to Andrew and to the choir for singing this evening, and those also from St. Edward's who have helped bring this evening together. It is not completely over. If you would like to hear Professor Ryrie maybe doing an impersonation of Barnes tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, we have our normal Eucharistic service, and Professor Ryrie will be preaching for us. Bishops among us may not want to, to join in. But we do have mulled wine and mince pies for us after our time together, so please do stay around, and thank you all for being part of such a wonderful evening and for this commemoration of this significant moment in history, 500 years in this very place. So thank you to everybody.